At dinner, my son said loudly, "You're a loser, Mom's new husband isn't." The table went silent. Forks froze midair. Someone stopped chewing. I felt every set of eyes turn toward me at once, heavy and expectant, like the room itself was leaning in. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I didn't say a word. Before I tell you what happened next, take a second to tap like if this kind of story hits close to home, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. And tell me this, have you ever been disrespected in front of people who expected you to react? My name is Mark. I'm in my 40s, living in the US. And for most of my life, I've been the quiet option people stopped worrying about. The server came by a moment later, asking if everything was okay. My ex-wife smiled too quickly and said yes. My son picked up his phone, already done with me. The conversation limped forward, forced and awkward, like a car running on a rim. I ate maybe 3 more bites. I don't remember what they tasted like. When the check came, I reached for it out of habit. Then I stopped. My hand hovered there for a second longer than necessary, before I pulled it back. No one commented on that either. Outside, the night air felt colder than it should have. My son didn't look at me when we said goodbye. He hugged his mother, nodded at her husband, and walked past me like I was furniture he'd already memorized. I watched him go, the words replaying in my head, not louder each time, but clearer. Sharper. Like they'd finally found the right place to settle. "You're a loser." I drove home alone. The road was familiar, muscle memory doing most of the work. Streetlights passed in steady intervals. My hand stayed steady on the wheel. On the outside, I probably looked fine. That's always been my strength. Inside, something kept shifting. It wasn't just what he said. It was how easily it came out. How comfortable he seemed saying it in front of everyone. How certain he was that there would be no cost. That certainty didn't come from nowhere. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. Tired eyes. Lines that hadn't been there 10 years ago. A face that had learned how to stay neutral even when it wasn't. I thought about all the small moments that never became arguments. The times I let a comment slide because it wasn't worth the fight. The times I paid for things quietly without expecting thanks. The times I chose peace over being understood. None of those decisions felt wrong when I made them. They felt adult, responsible, controlled. But sitting there at that light, I started to wonder when control began to look like permission. When I got home, the house was dark and quiet. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't check my phone. I sat at the kitchen table with nothing in front of me and let the silence do what it needed to do. Anger came first. Not explosive, just heavy. A weight pressing down on my ribs. Then embarrassment. Not for what he said, but for how predictable it must have looked from the outside. Middle-aged man gets insulted by his own son and swallows it. Then something else followed. Quieter. Clearer. Awareness. He hadn't insulted me to hurt me. He'd insulted me because he didn't think it mattered. That realization sat with me longer than the words themselves. I thought about correcting him, laying out the facts, the years, the sacrifices, the things he didn't see. I could have done it calmly. I'm good at calm. But the image that kept coming back was his face at the table. Not angry. Not confused. Confident. Correcting him now wouldn't change that. It would just tell him that if he pushed hard enough, I'd explain myself. I didn't want to explain myself anymore. I went to bed late that night. Sleep came in short stretches. Each time I woke up, the same thought surfaced before anything else. If this is how he sees me, it didn't start tonight. Morning came like it always does. Shower. Work clothes. Routine wrapped tight around the noise in my head. At work, I answered emails. I nodded in meetings. I did what was expected of me. No one there knew what had been said to me the night before. No one needed to. At lunch, my phone buzzed. A message from my son. He needed money. No apology. No mention of dinner. Just the assumption, typed out in a single line. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. This was the moment where things usually reset. Where I'd remind myself he's young, that he didn't mean it, that this is what being a father looks like. I felt the familiar urge to smooth it over. Then I put the phone face down. Not out of spite. Not to teach a lesson. Because something in me had finally gone quiet. That night at dinner hadn't made me angry enough to explode. It had made me tired enough to stop performing. I didn't know yet what that would cost me. I didn't know how long the silence would last, or who would break it first. All I knew was this: the sentence had landed. And this time, I wasn't rushing to make it disappear. Morning didn't arrive with clarity. It arrived with habit. The alarm went off at 6, the same sound it had made for years. I shut it off before the second buzz, more reflex than intention, and lay there staring at the ceiling while the house stayed still around me. No voices. No footsteps. Just the low hum of the air vent kicking on. I didn't think about what my son said right away. That surprised me. I brushed my teeth, shaved, poured coffee, moved through the kitchen like I was visiting someone else's life. It wasn't until I sat down at the table, alone, that the sentence came back. You're a loser. Not shouted. Not thrown. Just placed. I realized then that what hurt most wasn't the insult itself. It was how familiar it felt. This wasn't the first time I'd been spoken to like that. It was just the first time it had been said out loud, in front of witnesses, without apology. The pattern had been there for years, quiet enough to ignore, subtle enough to excuse. I used to tell myself I was choosing my battles. That staying calm was maturity. That not reacting meant I was in control. Those explanations worked for a long time. But sitting there with my coffee cooling in front of me, I started to see the pattern for what it was. I had become predictable. At work, it looked the same. I showed up early. I stayed late. I did the things that needed to be done without announcing them. When deadlines were tight, my name came up. When credit was handed out, it usually passed me by. Not maliciously. Just naturally. During a meeting that morning, my manager praised the team for pushing through a difficult quarter. He talked about adaptability, grit, resilience. All words I recognized. All words that floated just above my head, never landing. I nodded at the right moments. Took notes I didn't need. When someone else repeated an idea I'd shared weeks earlier, it was received like something new. I watched it happen without interrupting. That was part of the pattern too. At lunch, I ate at my desk. The break room felt too loud. I scrolled through my phone without really reading anything until a message from my son popped up. Need money for gas. I'll pay you back. No greeting. No acknowledgement of the night before. I stared at the screen and felt that familiar tightening in my chest. The unspoken rule hovering between us. I provide, he moves on. The ledger never balances, but we pretend it does. I didn't respond right away. That pause was new. I thought about all the times I'd stepped in quietly, covered something, smoothed something over, fixed a problem before it grew teeth. Each time, it felt like love. Each time, it taught something else. By the time I left work, the sun was already dropping behind the buildings. The drive home was slow, traffic thick and impatient. A truck cut me off, and I let it go without reaction. I was good at letting things go. At a red light, my phone buzzed again. You there? I imagined him waiting, foot tapping, already irritated. I imagined my ex-wife assuming I'd handle it. I imagined the easy version of myself typing sure and sending the money without comment. Instead, I put the phone back down. Not because I wanted him to struggle. Because I needed to understand why I always erased myself to prevent it. When I got home, I changed out of my work clothes and stood in the bedroom for a long moment, holding the hanger, not moving. The house felt bigger than it used to. Quieter in a way that wasn't peaceful. I thought about my son as a kid. How he used to wait by the window for me to get home. How he'd tell me every detail of his day like it mattered. Somewhere along the way, that version of me, the one who listened, who showed up, had become something else in his mind. Replaceable. That night, I cooked dinner for one. The TV stayed off. I ate slowly, paying attention to the sounds of my own fork against the plate. It felt strange, sitting with myself without distraction. Another message came in. Seriously? I could hear the tone in my head. The expectation layered underneath it. I typed out a response. Deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that, too. Every version sounded like an explanation, and I was done explaining. I didn't sleep well. I kept replaying moments I'd dismissed over the years. Little comments, casual dismissals, jokes that landed wrong but were framed as nothing. Each one small enough to ignore. Together, they formed something solid. In the morning, I checked my phone. Nothing. That absence felt heavier than the messages. At work, I made a mistake on a report. Not a big one, but enough to be noticed. My manager pointed it out gently, moved on. I corrected it without comment, but the irony wasn't lost on me. One misstep from me carried more weight than years of quiet consistency. On my way out, a coworker clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You're solid, man. Always dependable." I forced a smile. Dependable had become a ceiling. That evening my ex-wife called. "Did you see his messages?" she asked, skipping any kind of greeting. "I did," I said. "Well, there was." The expectation voiced this time. "I'm not fixing it," I said. There was a pause on the line, long enough for her to recalibrate. "What do you mean you're not fixing it?" "I mean," I said slowly, "I'm not stepping in right now." She exhaled sharply. "He's your son." "I know," I said. And I meant it. We ended the call without resolution. I sat there afterward, phone in my hand, feeling the weight of what I'd just done. This wasn't a stand. It wasn't a speech. It was a withdrawal. And for the first time, I wondered what would happen if I stopped being the quiet solution everyone leaned on without looking. I didn't feel powerful. I felt exposed. But underneath that exposure was something else beginning to take shape. A thin, unfamiliar line I hadn't crossed before. A boundary. I didn't know yet who would hit it first. The next morning, I woke up feeling the residue of last night's silence pressing down on me. The house was quiet, but heavy. Like it was waiting, not for anything in particular, but just waiting for me to show up. Work was the same as ever. Meetings, deadlines, emails stacking up like small, unavoidable avalanches. But the weight of the previous week followed me in. Every glance from a coworker felt sharper. Every casual remark in the office carried an unspoken evaluation. I could handle it, always could, but this time, I felt the quiet fatigue settling in my chest. I made a mistake on a spreadsheet, nothing major, but enough that the margin for error was noticeable. My manager caught it and corrected it gently. No drama, no judgment. But in that small correction, I saw it again. The invisible tally I had carried for years. Mistakes magnified, efforts minimized. During lunch, I received another text from my son. Simple. Direct. Expectant. Need money. I looked at the message and felt that same tightening in my chest I had felt at the dinner table. I knew exactly what it meant. He assumed I would provide. No explanation. No recognition. Just expectation. I didn't respond. Not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of habit now. The habit of restraint. I didn't know how long I could hold it or what the consequences would be. That evening, I walked into the apartment building, the hallway empty and dimly lit. The usual sounds of neighbors were absent. In some way, it felt like the quiet had become a companion. I let it guide me to my apartment without any distraction. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't check social media. I didn't even turn on the lights in the living room, just sat down in the dark, letting the weight of the day settle. I thought about my son as a younger boy, how he used to look up to me with wide eyes, waiting for guidance, needing validation. Somewhere along the way, the lens had changed. The trust that had once been implicit had eroded, replaced by assumption and indifference. And part of me had allowed it to happen. I reviewed the day's events in my mind. Each small correction I had swallowed. Each task I had done quietly without recognition. Each time I had remained calm while others took the credit. It had all been intended as patience, maturity, restraint. But I began to see it now as part of the pattern that had led to last night's insult. Another message from my son appeared. Seriously? I imagined him sitting there, phone in hand, waiting for the response, expecting me to smooth things over as I always had. I pictured my ex-wife assuming I would handle it without complaint. I imagined the ease with which I could type out a solution, as I had countless times before. I put the phone down and left it there. Not a dramatic gesture, not a calculated punishment. Just a quiet decision to stop erasing myself to meet the expectations of others. At work the next day, a colleague asked if I was okay, noting that I seemed quieter than usual. I nodded, gave a small smile, and kept moving. No one noticed the change. No one acknowledged the growing boundary I was starting to draw around myself. And that was okay. That invisibility had always been part of my life. Now it became a tool, a shield, a quiet weapon of control. I thought about stepping in and correcting my son. About sending him money and explaining why last night was unacceptable. But I realized that any explanation would only reinforce the pattern. I would be reacting, justifying, and teaching him that words had no consequence. That was a lesson I no longer wanted to teach. Instead, I let the quiet stretch through the day. I let it hold its weight. I let it define the boundary I had yet to articulate aloud. Evenings were hardest. Sitting alone with the silence, my mind wandered to every small concession, every overlooked effort, every moment of restraint that had, over the years, shifted from strength to expectation. I traced the chain backward, understanding the cumulative effect. Each decision had been deliberate. Each choice had been mine. And now, for the first time, the consequences were arriving without my intervention. I realized that I was not powerless. I was deliberate. Every action I hadn't taken, every correction I had withheld, became a statement. And the statement was starting to take form. Not through confrontation, not through speech, but through quiet, deliberate presence and absence alike. As I prepared for bed that night, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. Tired eyes, lined face, but steady gaze. I had been underestimated my whole life, erased without protest. But now I felt a subtle shift. Something unspoken growing between us all. A recognition that silence was no longer surrender. I didn't know how my son would react. I didn't know if my ex-wife would understand. But for the first time in years, I felt the faint pulse of control, of agency, quietly taking root within me. And with that, I turned off the light and let the night hold me, carrying the quiet weight forward, knowing that the next day, the pattern would continue to reveal itself, and I would watch, unflinching, as the consequences of my silence began to unfold. I saw him again that evening, my son, sprawled on the couch like he owned the space, phone in hand, earbuds in, completely absorbed in whatever world had nothing to do with me. He didn't look up when I walked in, and for a brief moment, a flicker of old instinct told me to grab the words, to speak, to correct the record. I didn't. The silence wasn't emptiness. It was choice. Deliberate. It pressed on my chest in the same way it had at dinner, but now I recognized it as a tool, a statement, a boundary. To correct him would have been to erase the shift that had quietly begun. Instead, I went to the kitchen and made myself a drink. The kettle whistled and I let it do so, listening to its shrill voice echo in the otherwise quiet apartment. I didn't offer a comment. I didn't wait for acknowledgement. I just moved through the motions, each deliberate action reinforcing the restraint I had been cultivating. He glanced up briefly, eyes flicking toward me as if he expected some reaction, then returned to his screen. That brief recognition was all I needed. The message had landed. Not verbally, not in confrontation, but in the unspoken awareness that I would not step in on command. At the table later, I noticed the usual markers of expectation in the things he said and did. Requests phrased like demands. Comments laced with assumption. Normally, I would have countered, explained, smoothed over. Now, I just listened, internalizing each one, cataloging them silently. I wasn't passive. I was deliberate. A question he threw out, small, casual, almost innocuous, hung in the air, waiting for my response. My mind drafted multiple replies, corrections, clarifications. Each one tempted me, each one felt familiar and safe. And each one I let go. I answered nothing, letting the quiet do the work instead of words. Later that night, another message arrived on my phone. Do you have a minute? It was loaded, as they all were now, with expectation and entitlement. I ignored it. Not forever. But long enough for the weight of the request to be felt, for the absence of immediate action to speak louder than any explanation I could have offered. I sat in my chair, back straight, hands resting on my knees. For the first time, I felt the tension of my role, the years of erasure, crystallizing into something clear. My presence didn't need to be constant. My correction didn't need to be immediate. My influence didn't require speech. At work the following day, I noticed the pattern had begun to ripple outward. A minor conflict between colleagues arose, one I would normally have intervened in to smooth things over. I stayed back. I observed. Let it resolve itself. I felt the unfamiliar, uncomfortable tug of letting things play out without my input. And it was uncomfortable, but instructive. By evening, the boundary had begun to show its first cracks in him. A minor hesitation when he asked something, a fleeting awareness that I might not answer the way he expected. That slight pause carried more weight than any lecture or reprimand. I didn't speak about it. I didn't explain. I let it settle. Each moment of quiet, each withheld reaction, was accumulating into something larger, shaping him as much as it was reshaping me. I realized then that my restraint was not weakness. It was leverage. Not the kind you wield loudly or angrily, but the kind that grows in quiet, deliberate absence. The kind that teaches without words, that shapes perception without confrontation. As I lay in bed that night, the city lights filtering through the blinds, I felt a subtle shift in the air between us. Not dramatic, not loud. Just recognition. A hint that the pattern was changing. That he was beginning to notice that I no longer moved solely to meet his expectations. I didn't feel relief yet. I didn't feel power. I felt the weight of the first deliberate pause, the first conscious refusal to correct, and I understood that this path would be uncomfortable for everyone involved. But I also understood that it was necessary. That change only arrives when the old patterns are allowed to confront themselves. Tomorrow, I thought, the silence will speak again. And I will listen, watch, and measure, not react. Not yet. That quiet decision, so simple on the surface, had begun to draw lines I hadn't dared to draw before. And I knew deep down that the consequences would come, but this time, they would be theirs to bear, not mine to smooth away. The morning light came uneven, slipping through the blinds and landing in streaks across the kitchen floor. I sipped my coffee slowly, feeling the weight of the previous days settle over me. Each quiet choice I had made, the restraint, the silence, the decisions not to correct him, was coming to life in ways I couldn't have predicted. The first text arrived mid-morning. Can you guess? Need money. Can you help? I looked at it, feeling the same tightening in my chest I had felt the night of the dinner. Only now, it wasn't just the words. It was the expectation behind them. The assumption. The unspoken entitlement. I didn't respond. Not out of anger. Not out of resentment. Simply because I had learned something the hard way. When you fix everything, you teach that boundaries are negotiable, that restraint is weakness. By noon, the consequences began. He had no car because he had left it at a friend's. No money because he hadn't thought ahead. And nowhere to go that felt safe. His casual certainty, the assumption that I would step in, collided with reality. The first phone call came in the afternoon. My ex-wife's voice, sharp and frantic, filled the room. He has nowhere to stay. He's calling me, panicked. You need to do something. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I didn't apologize. I just listened. I felt the tension in her words, the disbelief, the pressure to perform my role once again. And I stayed still. He's your son, she said finally, almost pleading. I know, I replied evenly. Short, precise. But the calm in my voice carried weight she hadn't anticipated. I wasn't stepping in this time. Not yet. Letting the consequences unfold was part of the lesson. I could hear him in the background, the faint crack in his confident tone. The certainty he had carried like armor was starting to show seams. Not because I said anything, but because I had withheld the usual fixes. The absence of intervention became louder than any words I could speak. By evening, I watched from a distance, letting events move forward without my input. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel cruel. I felt measured, deliberate. Each choice was a mirror, reflecting back the assumptions he had carried for years. The silence was heavy, yes, but it was also revealing. I thought back to the dinner, the words that had landed so casually and stayed. "You're a loser. Mom's new husband isn't." The phrase had echoed through my mind, and now I realized the echo had grown wings. The lesson had taken root in a way I couldn't force with words or confrontation. In that quiet evening I found clarity. My restraint was no longer simply about survival or patience, it was about agency. About showing without a single lecture or reproach that actions and expectations have consequences. That silence is sometimes the sharpest response. When the day ended, I didn't feel lighter. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady, anchored in something new, a line drawn not in anger, but in deliberate calm. A boundary that had been invisible for years was now tangible. And in that stillness, I sensed the first glimmer of recognition from him. Not spoken, not admitted, but present. A hesitation in his expectations. A subtle recalibration. The shift had begun, quietly, inexorably. I went to bed that night alone, as I had many nights before. But this time I carried a different weight. A quiet certainty that I was no longer merely the quiet option people relied on without thought. I was choosing what to carry and what to let fall. Tomorrow, I thought, the consequences will continue. And I will continue to watch, listen, and measure, not to punish, not to lecture, but to allow the truth of my choices to unfold naturally. The cost of being assumed was becoming clear, and for the first time, I let it speak for itself. The day started like any other, but I could feel a shift beneath the surface. The quiet I had maintained, the restraint I had held onto, was no longer abstract. It was tangible. The events of the past few days had begun to shape not only how my son saw me, but how I saw myself. I walked through the front door that morning, keys in hand, and paused. The usual signs of chaos were there: scattered laundry, dishes in the sink, the faint smell of unfinished meals. But something else was present too, a tension in the air that wasn't angry, just expectant. The weight of consequences had settled in. I didn't rush to fix it. At work, the day moved forward in its usual rhythm. Emails, meetings, minor crises that demanded attention. Normally, I would have responded immediately, smoothing edges, correcting oversights, absorbing the minor shocks so others could stay comfortable. But today, I noticed a new clarity in myself. I could let things be. I could observe without intervening. And more importantly, I could choose when to step in. My phone buzzed during lunch. Another message from my son. Simple, urgent. Need help. I stared at it longer than I should have, feeling the familiar pull of responsibility. But this time, I weighed it differently. Not emotionally. Not reflexively. Analytically. I imagined the consequences if I stepped in, if I stayed out. I considered what each choice would teach him and me. For the first time in years, I felt the power of restraint not as limitation, but as agency. I could act from clarity, not impulse. That evening, I spoke to my son directly. Not at the table. Not in the heat of frustration. I waited until we were both calm, alone in the living room. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list his faults. I didn't remind him of the times I had helped him without complaint. Instead, I spoke softly with measured calm. "I've let things happen for a while now," I said. "I haven't stepped in immediately because I needed you to understand that actions have consequences. That assumptions about me being your safety net aren't always reliable." He blinked, stunned. Not angry, not defensive, just quiet. The pause was heavy, but in that heaviness, I sensed understanding beginning to form. Not complete. Not verbalized. But present. I continued. "This doesn't mean I don't care. It means I've been showing you what responsibility looks like in real time. You're learning. I'm learning. And we're both going to be better because of it." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. The moment carried itself. The clarity wasn't in the words alone. It was in the shift, in the way I had held back, waited, and chosen the right moment. Not for retribution, not for power, but for transformation. Later, after he went to his room, I sat alone and reflected. The restraint, the silence, the withheld corrections, they had led to this. This understanding, this recalibration of relationship dynamics. This subtle shift in perception. It hadn't been easy. It had been uncomfortable, exposing, and uncertain. But it had been necessary. For the first time in years, I felt the intersection of internal control and external consequence. My choices were finally aligning with their impact. My silence had a voice. My patience had weight. My calm had power. That night, I looked out the window at the city lights. Quiet, steady, unassuming. Felt steady, anchored. Not because I had dominated, argued, or corrected immediately, but because I had chosen clarity over reaction, patience over impulse, and restraint over performative action. I knew challenges would continue. Misunderstandings, assumptions, and frustration were inevitable. But for the first time, I felt prepared, not with force, but with presence. With intention. With the understanding that true influence comes from measured, deliberate action, not from reflexive correction or immediate gratification. And as I closed my eyes that night, I understood. The turning point was never a single act. It was the accumulation of quiet decisions, the consistent practice of restraint, and the unwavering choice to act with clarity when it mattered most. The night air hit me as I walked into the apartment, carrying the same quiet tension that had settled over the past days. He was in the living room, headphones off this time, pacing with that restless energy he always seemed to summon when something didn't go his way. The usual assumption that I would step in, solve the problem, fix the mess, was written across his posture like a neon sign. I didn't react. Not immediately. I let him reach the apex of his frustration, letting the tension swell without interruption. My silence wasn't emptiness, it was deliberate. Observant. Measured. "Why didn't you answer me today?" he finally demanded, voice edged with irritation and confusion. I leaned against the doorway, steady, calm. "Because I wanted you to feel the consequences," I said quietly, each word chosen carefully. "Because I needed you to understand that actions have weight." He froze. The words sank in slower than I expected, not immediate shock, not anger, but hesitation, the first real pause I had seen in days. His assumption that I would always rescue him had been challenged, and now it hovered, fragile and untested. "Consequence?" he repeated, a little incredulously. "What are you talking about?" I stepped into the room, slowly, deliberately. "You've been assuming that I'm the safety net. That I will always solve things for you without question. That's not how it works anymore. Not because I don't care, but because I do care enough to let you learn." The air between us was heavy. Not hostile, but charged. Each word I had withheld over the past days now carried weight beyond their immediate meaning. The silence had done its work. The restraint had spoken. Now, the confrontation wasn't a clash, it was recognition. He didn't argue. He didn't storm out. He just looked at me, that confident smirk fading into something closer to uncertainty. I could see the thought forming in his mind. Maybe things aren't as automatic as I assumed. We sat down across from each other. I didn't lecture. I didn't recount past mistakes. I let him feel the discomfort of accountability, the subtle recognition that my silence had been more instructive than any argument I could have delivered. His eyes met mine, searching, trying to gauge the depth of the change. And I didn't flinch. "Are you really not going to help me?" he asked finally, quieter, tentative. I nodded, slowly. "I'll help when it's time, when you're ready to take responsibility. Not before. Not automatically." The shift was subtle, but undeniable. The balance had changed. My authority was no longer performative, it was earned, grounded in consistency, patience, and deliberate action. The weight of my past restraint had grown into a presence that could no longer be ignored. Later, after he went to his room, I sat alone in the living room. The tension had dissolved, replaced by a quiet clarity that felt almost tangible. This confrontation hadn't been explosive. It hadn't needed to be. The payoff wasn't in a raised voice or dramatic gesture. It was in composure, in presence, in the authority carried quietly but undeniably. I reflected on the days that had led here, the withheld messages, the deliberate non-responses, the observation of patterns and consequences. Every small act of restraint had built to this moment. And in this calm confrontation, I realized the truth. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it grows silently, until it can no longer be ignored. I went to bed that night with a sense of equilibrium I hadn't felt in years. Not relief. Not victory. Just clarity. I had confronted the situation fully, not with anger, not with force, but with deliberate, measured, internalized authority. And in doing so, I had not only reshaped the dynamic with my son, but I had reclaimed a part of myself I hadn't realized I'd been surrendering for years. The silence, the patience, the careful withholding of action, it had all led to this. And for the first time, I understood the full impact of deliberate restraint. The confrontation was over, but its lessons would linger. Its power would remain. And the path forward, while still challenging, was now unmistakably clear.